Chapter 17 of The Princess Priscilla's Fortnight by Elizabeth von Arnim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. About 3 o'clock that afternoon Priscilla saw quite clearly what she had dimly perceived in the morning, that if there was to be domestic peace in Creeper Cottage she must bestir herself. She did not like bestirring herself, at least not in such directions. She would go out and help the poor, talk to them, cheer them, nurse their babies even, and stir their porridge, but she had not up to this point realized her own needs, and how urgent they could be, and how importunate. It was hunger that cleared her vision. The first time she was hungry she had been amused. Now when it happened again she was both surprised and indignant. "Can one's wretched body never keep quiet?" she thought impatiently, when the first twinges dragged her relentlessly out of her dejected dreaming by the fire. She remembered the cold tremblings of the night before, and felt that that state would certainly be reached again quite soon if she did not stop it at once. She rang for Annalise. "Tell the cook I will have some luncheon after all," she said. "The cook is gone," said Annalise, whose eyes were more aggressively swollen than they had yet been. "Gone where?" "Gone away. Gone for ever." "But why?" asked Priscilla, really dismayed. "The Herr Geheimrath insulted her. I heard him doing it. No woman of decency can permit such a tone. She at once left. There has been no dinner to-day. There will be, I greatly fear, no supper." And Annalise gave a loud sob and covered her face with her apron. Then Priscilla saw that if life was to roll along at all it was her shoulder that would have to be put to the wheel. Fritzing's shoulder was evidently not a popular one among the lower classes. The vision of her own doing anything with wheels was sufficiently amazing, but she did not stop to gaze upon it. "Annalise," she said, getting up quickly and giving herself a little shake, "fetch me my hat and coat. I'm going out." Annalise let her apron drop far enough to enable her to point to the deluge going on out of doors. "Not in this weather," she faltered, images of garments soaked in mud and needing much drying and brushing troubling her. "Get me the things," said Priscilla. "Your Grand Ducal Highness will be wet through." "Get me the things, and don't cry quite so much. Crying really is the most shocking waste of time." Annalise withdrew, and Priscilla went round to Fritzing. It was the first time she had been round to him. He was sitting at his table, his head in his hands, staring at the furnishers' bills, and he started to see her coming in unexpectedly through the kitchen and shut the bill hastily in a drawer. "Fritzi, have you had anything to eat to-day?" "Certainly. I had an excellent breakfast." "Nothing since?" "I have not yet felt the need." "You know the cook Lady Shuttleworth sent has gone again?" "What, that woman who burst in upon me was Lady Shuttleworth's cook?" "Yes, and you frightened her so she ran home." "Ma'am, she overstepped the limits of my patience." "Dear Fritzi, I often wonder where exactly the limits of your patience are. With me they have withdrawn into infinite space. I've never been able to reach them. But everyone else seems to have a knack. Well, somebody must cook. You tell me Annalise won't. Perhaps she really can't. Anyhow, I cannot mention it to her, because it would be too horrible to have her flatly refusing to do something I told her to do, and yet not be able to send her away. But somebody must cook, and I'm going out to get the somebody. Hush!" She put up her hand as he opened his mouth to speak. "I know it's raining. I know I'll get wet. Don't let us waste time protesting. I'm going." Fritzing was conscience-stricken. "Ma'am," he said, "you must forgive me for unwittingly bringing this bother upon you. Had I had time for reflection I would not have been so sharp. But the woman burst upon me. I knew not who she was. Sooner than offend her I would have cut out my tongue, could I have foreseen you would yourself go in search in the rain for a substitute. Permit me to seek another." "No, no, you have no luck with cooks," said Priscilla, smiling. "I'm going. Why, I feel more cheerful already. Just getting out of that chair makes me feel better." "Were you not cheerful before?" inquired Fritzing anxiously. "Not very," admitted Priscilla. "But then neither were you. Don't suppose I didn't see you with your head in your hands when I came in. Cheerful people never seize their heads in that way. Now, Fritzi, I know what's worrying you. It's that absurd affair last night. I've left off thinking about it. I'm going to be very happy again, and so must you be. We won't let one mad young man turn all our beautiful life sour, will we?" He bent down and kissed her hand. "Permit me to accompany you at least," he begged. "I cannot endure." But she shook her head, and as she presently walked through the rain holding Fritzing's umbrella none had been bought to replace hers, broken on the journey, getting muddier and more draggled every minute, she felt that now indeed she had got down to elementary conditions, climbed right down out of the clouds to the place where life lies unvarnished and uncomfortable, where necessity spends her time forcing you to do all the things you don't like, where the whole world seems hungry and muddy and wet. It was an extraordinary experience for her, this slopping through the mud with soaking shoes, no prospect of a meal, and a heart that insisted on sinking in spite of her attempts to persuade herself that the situation was amusing. It did not amuse her. It might have amused somebody else, the Grand Duke, for instance, if he could have watched her now, from, say, a Gothic window, himself dry and fed and taken care of, being punished so naturally and inevitably by the weapons Providence never allows to rust, those weapons that save parents and guardians so much personal exertion if only they will let things take their course, those sharp swift consequences that attend the actions of the impetuous. I might indeed, if this were a sermon and there were a congregation unable to get away, expatiate on the habit these weapons have of smiting with equal fury the just and the unjust. How you only need to be a little foolish, quite a little foolish, under conditions that seem to force it upon you, and down they come, sure and relentless, and you are smitten with a thoroughness that leaves you lame for years. How motives are nothing, circumstances are nothing, how the motives may have been aflame with goodness, the circumstances such that any other course was impossible, how all these things don't matter in the least. You are and shall be smitten. But this is not a sermon. I have no congregation, and why should I preach to a reader who meanwhile has skipped? It comforted Priscilla to find that almost the whole village wanted to come and cook for her, or as the women put it, do for her. Their cooking powers were strictly limited, and they proposed to make up for this by doing for her very completely in other ways. They would scrub, sweep, clean windows, wash, anything and everything they would do. Would they also sew buttons on her uncle's clothes, Priscilla asked anxiously. And they were ready to sew buttons all over Fritzing if buttons would make him happy. Their eagerness was very gratifying, but it was embarrassing as well. The extremely aged and the extremely young were the only ones that refrained from offering their services. Some of the girls were excluded as too weedy, some of the mothers because their babies were too new, some of the wives because their husbands were too exacting. But when Priscilla counted up the names she had written down, she found there were 25. For a moment she was staggered. Then she rose to the occasion and got out of the difficulty with what she thought great skill, arranging, as it was impossible to disappoint 24 of these, that they should take it in turn, each coming for one day until all had had a day, and then beginning again with the first one. It seemed a brilliant plan. Life at Creeper Cottage promised to be very varied. She gathered them together in the village shop to talk it over. She asked them if they thought 10 shillings a day and food would be enough. She asked it hesitatingly, afraid lest she was making them an impossibly frugal offer. She was relieved at the cry of assent, but it was followed after a moment by murmurs from the married women, when they had had time to reflect, that it was unfair to pay the raw young ones at the same rate as themselves. Priscilla, however, turned a deaf ear to their murmurings. "The girls may not," she said, raising her hand to impose silence, "be able to get through as much as you do in a day, but they'll be just as tired when evening comes. Certainly I shall give them the same wages." She made them draw lots as to who should begin, and took the winner home with her then and there. She too, though the day was far spent, was to have her 10 shillings. "What, have you forgotten your New Testaments?" Priscilla cried when more murmurs greeted this announcement. "Don't you remember the people who came at the 11th hour to labour in the vineyard and got just the same as the others? Why should I try to improve on parables?" And there was something about Priscilla, an air, an authority, that twisted the women of Symford into any shape of agreement she chose. The 24 went their several ways. The 25th ran home to put on a clean apron, and got back to the shop in time to carry the eggs and butter and bread Priscilla had bought. "I forgot to bring any money," said Priscilla when the postmistress, it was she who kept the village shop, told her how much it came to. "Does it matter?" "Oh, don't mention it, Miss Neumann Schultz." was the pleasant answer of that genteel and trustful lady, and she suggested that Priscilla should take with her a well-recommended leg of mutton she had that day for sale as well. Priscilla shuddered at the sight of it, and determined never to eat legs of mutton again. The bacon, too, piled up on the counter, revolted her. The only things that looked as decent raw as when they were cooked were eggs, and on eggs she decided she and Fritzing would in future live. She broke off a piece of the crust of the bread Mrs. Vickerton was wrapping up and ate it, putting great pressure on herself to do it carelessly, with a becoming indifference. "It's good bread," said Mrs. Vickerton, doing up her parcel. "Where in the world do you get it from?" asked Priscilla enthusiastically. "The man must be a genius." "The carrier brings it every day," said Mrs. Vickerton, pleased and touched by such appreciation. "It's a Minehead baker's." "He ought to be given an order, if ever man ought." "An order? For you regular, Miss Neumann Schultz?" "No, no, the sort you pin on your breast," said Priscilla. "Ho," smiled Mrs. Vickerton vaguely, who did not follow. She was so genteel that she could never have enough of aspirates. And Priscilla, giving the parcel to her breathless new help, hurried back to Creeper Cottage. Now this help, or chargirl, you could not call her a charwoman, she was manifestly still so very young, was that Emma who had been obliged to tell the vicar's wife about Priscilla's children's treat, and who did not punctually return books. I will not go so far as to say that not to return books punctually is sinful, although deep down in my soul I think it is, but anyhow it is a symptom of moral slackness. Emma was quite good so long as she was left alone. She could walk quite straight so long as there were no stones in the way and nobody to pull her aside. If there were stones she instantly stumbled. If somebody pulled she instantly went. She was weak, amiable, well-intentioned. She had a widowed father who was unpleasant and who sometimes beat her on Saturday nights. And on Sunday mornings sometimes, if the fumes of the cock and hens still hung about him, threw things at her before she went to church. A widowed father in Emma's class is an ill being to live with. The vicar did his best to comfort her. Mrs. Morrison talked of the commandments and of honouring one's father and mother, and of how the less there was to honour, the greater glory of doing it. And Emma was so amiable that she actually did manage to honour him 6 days out of the 7. At the same time she could not help thinking it would be nice to go away to a place where he wasn't. They were extremely poor, almost the poorest family in the village, and the vision of possessing 10 shillings of her very own was a dizzy one. She had a sweetheart, and she had sent him word by a younger sister of the good fortune that had befallen her, and begged him to come up to Creeper Cottage that evening and help her carry the precious wages safely home. And at 9 o'clock, when her work was done, she presented herself, all blushes and smiles, before Priscilla, and shyly asked her for them. Priscilla was alone in her parlour reading. She referred her, as her habit was, to Fritzing. But Fritzing had gone out for a little air, the rain having cleared off, and when the girl told her so, Priscilla bade her come round in the morning and fetch the money. Emma's face fell so woefully at this, was not her John at that moment all expectant around the corner, that Priscilla smiled and got up to see if she could find some money herself. In the first drawer she opened in Fritzing's sitting room was a pocket-book, and in this pocket-book Fritzing's last £5 note. There was nothing else except the furnisher's bill. She pushed that on one side without looking at it. What did bills matter? Bills never yet had mattered to Priscilla. She pushed it on one side and searched for silver, but found none. "Perhaps you can change this," she said, holding out the note. "The shop's shut now, miss," said Emma, gazing with round eyes at the mighty sum. "Well then, take it, and bring me the change in the morning." Emma took it with trembling fingers. She had not in her life touched so much money, and ran out into the darkness to where her John was waiting. Symford never saw either of them again. Priscilla never saw her change. Emma went to perdition. Priscilla went back to her chair by the fire. She was under the distinct and comfortable impression that she had been the means of making the girl happy. "How easy it is, making people happy," thought Priscilla placidly, the sweetest smile on her charming mouth. End of chapter 17. Priscilla's Fortnight by Elizabeth von Arnim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Bad luck, it will be seen, dogged the footsteps of Priscilla. Never, indeed, for a single hour after she entered Creeper Cottage did the gloomy lady cease from her attentions. The place was pervaded by her thick and evil atmosphere. Fritzing could not go out for an airing without something of far-reaching consequence happening while he was away. It was, of course, bad luck that made the one girl in Symford who was easily swayed by passing winds of temptation draw the lot that put the £5 note into her hands. If she had come to the cottage just one day later, or if the rain had gone on just half an hour longer and kept Fritzing indoors, she would, I have no doubt whatever, be still in Symford, practising every feeble virtue either on her father or on her John, by this time probably her very own John. As it was, she was a thief, a lost soul, a banished face for ever from the ways of grace. Thus are we all the sport of circumstance. Thus was all Symford the sport of Priscilla. Fritzing knew nothing of his loss. He had not told Priscilla a word of his money difficulties, his idea being to keep every cloud from her life as long and as completely as possible. Besides, how idle to talk of these things to someone who could in no way help him with counsel or suggestions. He had put the money in his drawer, and the thought that it was still unchanged and safe comforted him a little in the watches of the sleepless nights. Nothing particular happened on the Thursday morning, except that the second of the 25 kept on breaking things, and Priscilla, who was helping Fritzing arrange the books he had ordered from London, remarked at the 5th terrific smash, a smash so terrific as to cause Creeper Cottage to tremble all over, that more crockery had better be bought. "Yes," said Fritzing, glancing swiftly at her with almost a guilty glance. He felt very keenly his want of resourcefulness in this matter of getting the money over from Germany, but he clung to the hope that a few more wakeful nights would clear his brain and show him the way, and meanwhile there was always the £5 note in the drawer. "And Fritzi, I shall have to get some clothes soon," Priscilla went on, dusting the books as he handed them to her. "Clothes, ma'am?" repeated Fritzing, straightening himself to stare at her. "Those things you bought for me in Gerstein. They're delicious, they're curiosity, but they're not clothes. I mean always to keep them. I'll have them put in a glass case, and they shall always be near me when we're happy again." "Happy again, ma'am?" "Settled again, I mean," quickly amended Priscilla. She dusted in silence for a little, and began to put the books she had dusted in the shelves. "I'd better write to Paris," she said presently. Fritzing jumped. "Paris, ma'am?" "They've got my measurements. This dress can't stand much more. It's the one I've worn all the time. The soaking it got yesterday was very bad for it. You don't see such things, but if you did, you'd probably get a tremendous shock." "Ma'am, if you write to Paris you must give your own name, which of course is impossible. They will send nothing to an unknown customer in England called Neumann Schultz." "Oh, but we'd send the money with the order. That's quite easy, isn't it?" "Perfectly easy," said Fritzing in an oddly exasperated voice, at once adding still more snappily, "Might I request your Grand Ducal Highness to have the goodness not to put my Aeschylus, a most valuable edition, head downwards on the shelf? It's a manner of treating books often to be observed in housemaids and similar ignorance. But you, ma'am, have been trained by me, I trust, in other and more reverent ways of handling what is left to us of the mighty spirits of the past." "I'm sorry," said Priscilla, hastily turning the Aeschylus right side up again, and by launching forth into a long and extremely bitter dissertation on the various ways persons of no intellectual conscience have of ill-treating books, he got rid of some of his agitation and fixed her attention for the time on questions less fraught with complications than clothes from Paris. About 2:30 they were still sitting over the eggs and bread and butter that Priscilla ordered 3 times a day and that Fritzing ate with unquestioning obedience, when the Shuttleworth Victoria stopped in front of the cottage and Lady Shuttleworth got out. Fritzing, polite man, hastened to meet her, pushing aside the footman and offering his arm. She looked at him vaguely and asked if his niece were at home. "Certainly," said Fritzing, leading her into Priscilla's parlour. "Shall I inquire if she will receive you?" "Do," said Lady Shuttleworth, taking no apparent notice of the odd wording of this question. "Tussie isn't well," she said the moment Priscilla appeared, fixing her eyes on her face but looking as though she hardly saw her. as though she saw past her, through her, to something beyond, while she said a lesson learned by rote. "Isn't he? Oh, I'm sorry," said Priscilla. "He caught cold last Sunday at your treat. He oughtn't to have run those races with the boys. He can't stand much." Priscilla looked at her questioningly. The old lady's face was quite set and calm, but there had been a queer catch in her voice at the last words. "Why does he do such things, then?" asked Priscilla, feeling vaguely distressed. "Ah, yes, my dear, why? That is a question for you to answer, is it not?" "For me? On Tuesday night," continued Lady Shuttleworth, "he was ill when he left home to come here. He would come. It was a terrible night for a delicate boy to go out. And he didn't stay here, I understand. He went out to buy something after closing time, and stood a long time trying to wake the people up." "Yes," said Priscilla, feeling guilty. That was my fault. He went for me." "Yes, my dear. Since then he has been ill. I've come to ask you if you'll drive back with me and see if you cannot persuade him that you are happy. He seems to be much troubled." "Troubled?" "He seems to be afraid you are not happy, you know," she added with a little quavering smile. "Tussie is very kind. He's very unselfish. He takes everybody's burdens on his shoulders. He seems to be quite haunted by the idea that your life here is unendurably uncomfortable, and it worries him dreadfully that he can't get to you and set things right. I think if he were to see you, and you were very cheerful and smiled, my dear, it might help him to get over this." "Get him over this?" echoed Priscilla. "Is he so ill?" Lady Shuttleworth looked at her and said nothing. "Of course I'll come," said Priscilla, hastily ringing the bell. "But you must not look unhappy," said Lady Shuttleworth, laying her hand on the girl's arm. "That would make matters 10 times worse. You must promise to be as gay as possible." "Yes, yes, I'll be gay," promised Priscilla, while her heart became as lead within her at the thought that she was the cause of poor Tussie's sufferings. But was she really, she asked herself during that drive? What had she done but accept help eagerly offered? Surely it was very innocent to do that. It was what she had been doing all her life, and people had been delighted when she let them be kind to her, and certainly had not got ill immediately afterwards. Were you never to let anybody do anything for you, lest while they were doing it they should get wet feet and things, and then their colds would be upon your head? She was very sorry Tussie should be ill, dreadfully sorry. He was so kind and good that it was impossible not to like him. She did like him. She liked him quite as well as most young men, and much better than many. "I'm afraid you're very unhappy," she said suddenly to Lady Shuttleworth, struck by the look on her face as she leaned back silent in her corner. "I do feel rather at my wits' end," said Lady Shuttleworth. "For instance, I'm wondering whether what I'm doing now isn't a great mistake." "What are you doing now?" "Taking you to see Tussie." "Oh, but I promised to be cheerful. I'll tell him how comfortable we are. He'll see I look well taken care of." "But for all that I'm afraid he may. Why, we're going to be tremendously taken care of. Even he will see that. Only think, I've engaged 25 cooks." "25 cooks?" echoed Lady Shuttleworth, staring in spite of her sorrows. "But isn't my kitchen maid?" "Oh, she left us almost at once. She couldn't stand my uncle. He is rather difficult to stand at first. You have to know him quite a long while before you can begin to like him, and I don't think kitchen maids ever would begin." "But, my dear, 25 cooks!" And Priscilla explained how and why she had come by them, and though Lady Shuttleworth, remembering the order till now prevailing in the village and the lowness of the wages, could not help thinking that here was a girl more potent for mischief than any girl she had ever met, yet a feeble gleam of amusement did, as she listened, slant across the inky blackness of her soul. Tussie was sitting up in bed with a great many pillows behind him, finding immense difficulty in breathing, when his mother, her bonnet off and every trace of having been out removed, came in and said Miss Neumann Schultz was downstairs. "Downstairs? Here? In this house?" gasped Tussie, his eyes round with wonder and joy. "Yes, she called. Would you like her to come up and see you?" "Oh, mother!" Lady Shuttleworth hurried out. How could she bear this, she thought, stumbling a little as though she did not see very well. She went downstairs with the sound of that "Oh, mother" throbbing in her ears. Tussie's temperature, high already, went up by leaps during the few minutes of waiting. He gave feverish directions to the nurse about a comfortable chair being put exactly in the right place, about his pillows being smoothed, his medicine bottles hidden, and was very anxious that the flannel garment he was made to wear when ill, a garment his mother called a nightingale, not after the bird but the lady, and that was the bluest flannel garment ever seen, should be arranged neatly over his narrow chest. The nurse looked disapproving. She did not like her patients to be happy. Perhaps she was right. It is always better, I believe, to be cautious and careful, to husband your strength, to be deadly prudent and deadly dull. As you would poison, so should you avoid doing what the poet calls living too much in your large hours. The truly prudent never have large hours, nor should you if you want to be comfortable. And you get your reward, I am told, in living longer, in having, that is, a few more of those years that cluster round the end, during which you are fed and carried and washed by persons who generally grumble. Who wants to be a flame, doomed to be blown out by the same gust of wind that has first fanned it to its very brightest? If you are not a flame, you cannot, of course, be blown out. Gusts no longer shake you. Tempests pass you by untouched. And if, besides, you have the additional advantage of being extremely smug, extremely thick-skinned, you shall go on living until 90, and not during the whole of that time be stirred by so much as a single draught. Priscilla came up determined to be so cheerful that she began to smile almost before she got to the door. "I've come to tell you how splendidly we're getting on at the cottage," she said, taking Tussie's lean hot hand, the shell of her smile remaining, but the heart and substance gone out of it. He looked so pitiful and strange. "Really, really," choked Tussie, putting the other lean hot hand over hers and burning all the coolness out of it. The nurse looked still more disapproving. She had not heard Sir Augustus had a fiancé, and even if he had, this was no time for philandering. She too had noticed the voice in which he had said, "Oh, mother," and she saw by his eyes that his temperature had gone up. Who was this shabby young lady? She felt sure that no one so shabby could be his fiancé, and she could only conclude that Lady Shuttleworth must be mad. "Nurse, I'm going to stay here a little," said Lady Shuttleworth. "I'll call you when I want you." "I think, madam, Sir Augustus ought not," began the nurse. "No, no, he shall not. Go and have 40 winks, nurse." And the nurse had to go. People generally did when Lady Shuttleworth sent them. "Sit down. No, don't. Stay a moment like this," said Tussie, his breath coming in little jerks. "Unless you're tired. Did you walk?" "I'm afraid you're very ill," said Priscilla, leaving her hand in his and looking down at him with a face that all her efforts could not induce to smile. "Oh, I'll be all right soon. How good of you to come. You've not been hungry since?" "No, no," said Priscilla, stroking his hands with her free hand and giving them soothing pats as one would to a sick child. "Really not? I've thought of that ever since. I've never got your face that night out of my head. What had happened? While I was away. What had happened?" "Nothing. Nothing had happened," said Priscilla hastily. "I was tired. I had a mood. I get them, you know. I get angry easily. Then I like to be alone till I'm sorry." "But what had made you angry? Had I—" "No, never. You've never been anything but good and kind. You've been our protecting spirit since we came here." Tussie laughed shrilly and immediately was seized by a coughing fit. Lady Shuttleworth stood at the foot of the bed watching him with a face from which happiness seemed to have fled for ever. Priscilla grew more and more wretched, caught, obliged to stand there, distractedly stroking his hands in her utter inability to think of anything else to do. "A nice protecting spirit," gasped Tussie derisively when he could speak. "Look at me here, tied down to this bed for heaven knows how long, and not able to do a thing for you." "But there's nothing now to do. We're quite comfortable. We are really. Do believe it." "Are you only comfortable, or are you happy as well?" "Oh, we're very happy," said Priscilla, with all the emphasis she could get into her voice, and again she tried, quite unsuccessfully, to wrench her mouth into a smile. "Then if you're happy, why do you look so miserable?" He was gazing up into her face with eyes whose piercing brightness would have frightened the nurse. There was no shyness now about Tussie. There never is about persons whose temperature is 102. "Miserable?" repeated Priscilla. She tried to smile, looked helplessly at Lady Shuttleworth, looked down again at Tussie, and stammering, "Because you're so ill and it's all my fault." To her horror, to her boundless indignation at herself, 2 tears, big and not to be hidden, rolled down her face and dropped onto Tussie's and her clasped hands. Tussie struggled to sit up straight. "Look, mother, look," he cried, gasping. "My beautiful one, my dear and lovely one, my darling. She's crying. I've made her cry. Now never tell me I'm not a brute again. See what I've done." "Oh," murmured Priscilla, in great distress and amazement. Was the poor dear delirious? And she tried to get her hands away. But Tussie would not let them go. He held them in a clutch that seemed like hot iron in both his, and dragging himself nearer to them, covered them with wild kisses. Lady Shuttleworth was appalled. "Tussie," she said in a very even voice, "you must let Miss Neumann Schultz go now. You must be quiet again now. Let her go, dear. Perhaps she'll come again." "Oh, mother, leave me alone," cried Tussie, lying right across his pillows, his face on Priscilla's hands. "What do you know of these things? This is my darling. This is my wife. Dream of my spirit. Star of my soul." "Never in this world," cried Lady Shuttleworth, coming round to the head of the bed as quickly as her shaking limbs would take her. Yes, yes, come here if you like, mother. Come close. Listen while I tell her how I love her. I don't care who hears. Why should I? If I weren't ill I'd care. I'd be tongue-tied. I'd have gone on being tongue-tied for ever. Oh, I bless being ill. I bless being ill. I can say anything, anything." "Tussie, don't say it," entreated his mother. "The less you say now, the more grateful you'll be later on. Let her go." "Listen to her," cried Tussie, interrupting his kissing of her hands to look up at Priscilla and smile with a sort of pitying wonder. "Let you go? Does one let one's life go? One's hope of salvation go? One's little precious minute of perfect happiness go? When I'm well again I shall be just as dull and stupid as ever, just such a shy fool, not able to speak." "But it's a gracious state," stammered poor Priscilla. "Loving you? Loving you?" "No, no, not being able to speak. It's always best." "It isn't. It's best to be true to one's self, to show honestly what one feels, as I am now. As I am now." And he fell to kissing her hands again. "Tussie, this isn't being honest," said Lady Shuttleworth sternly. "It's being feverish." "Listen to her. Was ever a man interrupted like this in the act of asking a girl to marry him?" "Tussie," cried Lady Shuttleworth. "Ethel, will you marry me because I love you so? It's an absurd reason, the most magnificently absurd reason, but I know there's no other why you should." Priscilla was shaken and stricken as she never yet had been. Shaken with pity, stricken with remorse. She looked down at him in dismay while he kissed her hands with desperate, overwhelming love. What was she to do? Lady Shuttleworth tried to draw her away. What was she to do? If Tussie was overwhelmed with love, she was overwhelmed with pity. "Ethel, Ethel," gasped Tussie, kissing her hands, looking up at her, kissing them again. Pity overcame her and engulfed her. She bent her head down to his and laid her cheek an instant on the absurd flannel nightingale, tenderly, apologetically. "Ethel, Ethel," choked Tussie, "will you marry me?" "Dear Tussie," she whispered in a shaky whisper, "I promise to answer you when you are well. Not yet, not now. Get quite well, and then if you still want an answer I promise to give you one. Now let me go." "Ethel," implored Tussie, looking at her with wild entreaty in his eyes, "will you kiss me just once to help me to live?" And in her desire to comfort him she stooped down again and did kiss him, soberly, almost gingerly, on the forehead. He let her hand slide away from between his and lay back on his pillows in a state for the moment of absolute beatitude. He shut his eyes and did not move while she crept softly out of the room. "What have you done?" asked Lady Shuttleworth, trembling, when they were safely in the passage and the door shut behind them. "I can't think, I can't think," groaned Priscilla, wringing her hands. And leaning against the balusters, then and there, in that most public situation, she began very bitterly to cry. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Princess Priscilla's Fortnight by Elizabeth von Arnim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Priscilla went home dazed. All her suitors hitherto had approached her ceremoniously, timidly, through the Grand Duke, and we know they had not approached very near. But here was one, timid enough in health, who was positively reckless under circumstances that made most people meek. He had proposed to her arrayed in a blue flannel nightingale, and Priscilla felt that headlong self-effacement could go no further. "He must have a great soul," she said to herself over and over again during the drive home. "A great, great soul." And it seemed of little use wiping her tears away, so many fresh ones immediately took their place. She ached over Tussie and Tussie's mother. What had she done? She felt she had done wrong, yet how except by just existing, and she did feel she couldn't help doing that. Certainly she had made two kind hearts extremely miserable. One was miserable now, and the other didn't yet know how miserable it was going to be. She ought to have known, she ought to have thought, she ought to have foreseen. She, of all persons in the world, ought to have been careful with young men who believed her to be of their own class. Contrition and woe took possession of Priscilla's soul. She knew it was true that she could not help existing, but she knew besides, far back in a remote and seldom investigated corner of her mind, a corner on which she did not care to turn the light of careful criticism, that she ought not to be existing in Symford. It was because she was there, out of her proper sphere, in a place she had no business to be at all, that these strange and heart-wringing scenes with young men occurred. And Fritzing would notice her red eyes and ask what had happened, and here within 2 days was a second story to be told of a young man unintentionally hurried to his doom. Would Fritzing be angry? She never knew beforehand. Would he, only remembering she was Grand Ducal, regard it as an insult and want to fight Tussie? The vision of poor Tussie, weak, fevered, embedded in pillows, swathed in flannel, receiving bloodthirsty messages of defiance from Fritzing, upset her into more tears. Fritzing, she felt at that moment, was a trial. He burdened her with his gigantic efforts to keep her from burdens. He burdened her with his inflated notions of how burdenless she ought to be. He was admirable, unselfish, devoted, but she felt it was possible to be too admirable, too unselfish, too devoted. In a word, Priscilla's mind was in a state of upheaval, and the only ray of light she saw anywhere, and never was ray more watery, was that Tussie, for the moment at least, was content. The attitude of his mother, on the other hand, was distressing and disturbing. There had been no more "my dears" and other kind ways. She had watched her crying on the stairs in stony silence, had gone down with her to the door in stony silence, and just at the last had said in an unmistakably stony voice, "All this is very cruel." Priscilla was overwhelmed by the difficulties of life. The world was too much with her, she felt, a very great deal too much. She sent the Shuttleworth carriage away at the entrance to the village and went in to sit with Mrs. Jones a little, so that her eyes might lose their redness before she faced Fritzing. And Mrs. Jones was so glad to see her, so full of praises of her unselfish goodness in coming in, that once again Priscilla was forced to be ashamed of herself and of everything she did. "I'm not unselfish and I'm not good," she said, smoothing the old lady's coverlet. Mrs. Jones chuckled faintly. "Pretty, dear," was her only comment. "I don't think I'm pretty, and I know I'm not a dear," said Priscilla, quite vexed. "Ain't you then, dearie?" murmured Mrs. Jones soothingly. Priscilla saw it was no use arguing, and taking up the Bible that always lay on the table by the bed, began to read aloud. She read and read until both were quieted. Mrs. Jones into an evidently sweet sleep, she herself into peace. Then she left off and sat for some time watching the old lady, the open Bible in her lap, her soul filled with calm words and consolations, wondering what it could be like, being so near death. Must it not be beautiful, thought Priscilla, to slip away so quietly in that sunny room, with no sound to break the peace but the ticking of the clock that marked off the last minutes, and outside the occasional footstep of a passer-by, still hurrying on life's business. Wonderful to have done with everything, to have it all behind one, settled, lived through, endured. The troublous joys as well as the pains, all finished. The griefs and the stinging happinesses, all alike lived down. And now evening, and sleep. In the few days Priscilla had known her, the old lady had drawn visibly nearer death. Lying there on the pillow, so little and light that she hardly pressed it down at all, she looked very near it indeed. And how kind death was, rubbing away the traces of what must have been a sordid existence, set about years back with the usual coarse pleasures and selfish hopes. How kind death was, letting all there was of spirit shine out so sweetly at the end. There was an enlarged photograph of Mrs. Jones and her husband over the fireplace, a photograph taken for their silver wedding. She must have been about 45. How kind death was, thought Priscilla, looking from the picture to the figure on the bed. She sighed a little and got up. Life lay before her, an endless ladder up each of whose steep rungs she would have to clamber, in every sort of weather she would have to clamber, getting more battered, more blistered with every rung. She looked wistfully at the figure on the bed and sighed a little. Then she crept out and softly shut the door. She walked home lost in thought. As she was going up the hill to her cottage, Fritzing suddenly emerged from it and indulged in movements so strange and complicated that they looked like nothing less than a desperate dancing on the doorstep. Priscilla walked faster, staring in astonishment. He made strange gestures, his face was pale, his hair rubbed up into a kind of infuriated mop. "Why, what in the world?" began the amazed Priscilla, as soon as she was near enough. "Ma'am, I've been robbed," shouted Fritzing, and all Symford might have heard it if it had happened to be listening. "Robbed?" repeated Priscilla. "What of?" "Of all my money, ma'am, of all I had, of all we had to live on." "Nonsense, Fritzi," said Priscilla, but she did turn a little paler. "Don't let us stand out here," she added, and she got him in and shut the street door. He would have left it open and would have shouted his woes through it as through a trumpet down the street, oblivious of all things under heaven but his misfortune. He tore open the drawer of the writing table. "In this drawer, in the pocket book you see in this drawer, in this now empty pocket book did I leave it. It was there yesterday, it was there last night, now it is gone. Miscreants from without have visited us, or perhaps viler still, miscreants from within, a miscreant I do believe capable of anything, Annalise." "Fritzi, I took a £5 note out of that last night, if that's what you miss." "You, ma'am?" "To pay the girl who worked here her wages. You weren't here. I couldn't find anything smaller." "Gott sei Dank," cried Fritzing, going back to German in his joy. "Oh, ma'am, if you had told me earlier you would have spared me great anguish. Have you the change?" "Didn't she bring it?" "Bring it, ma'am?" "I gave it to her last night to change. She was to bring it round this morning. Didn't she?" Fritzing stared aghast. Then he disappeared into the kitchen. In a moment he was back again. "She has not been here," he said in a voice packed once more with torment. "Perhaps she's forgotten." "Ma'am, how came you—" "Now you're going to scold me." "No, no, but how is it possible that you should have trusted—" "Fritzi, you are going to scold me, and I'm so tired. What else has been taken? You said all your money." He snatched up his hat. "Nothing else, ma'am, nothing else. I will go and seek the girl." And he clapped it down over his eyes as he always did in moments of great mental stress. "What a fuss," thought Priscilla wearily. Aloud she said, "The girl here to-day will tell you where she lives. Of course she has forgotten or not been able to change it yet." And she left him and went out to get into her own half of the house. Yes, Fritzi really was a trial. Why such a fuss and such big words about £5? If it were lost and the girl afraid to come and say so, it didn't matter much. Anyhow, nothing like so much as having one's peace upset. How foolish to be so agitated and talk of having been robbed of everything. Fritzing's mind, she feared, that large enlightened mind on whose breadth and serenity she had gazed admiringly ever since she could remember gazing at all, was shrinking to dimensions that would presently exactly match the dimensions of Creeper Cottage. She went upstairs disheartened and tired, and dropping down full length on her sofa desired Annalise to wash her face. "Your Grand Ducal Highness has been weeping," said Annalise, whisking the sponge in and out of corners with a skill surprising in one who had only practised the process during the last 10 days. Priscilla opened her eyes to stare at her in frankest surprise, for never yet had Annalise dared make a remark unrequested. Annalise, by beginning to wash them, forced her to shut them again. Priscilla then opened her mouth to tell her what she thought of her. Immediately Annalise's swift sponge stopped it up. "Your Grand Ducal Highness," said Annalise, washing Priscilla's mouth with a thoroughness and an amount of water suggestive of its not having been washed for months, "told me only yesterday that weeping was a terrible schreckliche waste of time. Therefore, since your Grand Ducal Highness knows that and yet herself weeps, it is easy to see that there exists a reason for weeping which makes weeping inevitable." "Will you?" began Priscilla, only to be stopped instantly by the ready sponge. "Your Grand Ducal Highness is unhappy. 'Tis not to be wondered at. Trust a faithful servant, one whose lifeblood is at your Grand Ducal Highness's disposal, and tell her, if it is not then true, that the Herr Geheimrath has decoyed you from your home and your Grossherzogliche Herr Papa." "Will you?" Again the bouncing sponge. "My heart bleeds, indeed it bleeds, to think of the Herr Papa's sufferings, his fears, his anxieties. It is a picture on which I cannot calmly look. Day and night, for at night I lie sleepless on my bed, I am inquiring of myself what it can be, the spell that the Herr Geheimrath has cast over your Grand Ducal. Will you?" Again the pouncing sponge. But this time Priscilla caught the girl's hand and, holding it at arm's length, sat up. "Are you mad?" she asked, looking at Annalise as though she saw her for the first time. Annalise dropped the sponge and clasped her hands. "Not mad," she said, "only very, very devoted." "No, mad. Give me a towel." Priscilla was so angry that she did not dare say more. If she had said a part even of what she wanted to say, all would have been over between herself and Annalise, so she dried her face in silence, declining to allow it to be touched. "You can go," she said, glancing at the door, her face pale with suppressed wrath, but also, it must be confessed, very clean. And when she was alone she dropped once again onto the sofa and buried her head in the cushion. How dared Annalise? How dared she? How dared she? Priscilla asked herself over and over again, wincing, furious. Why had she not thought of this, known that she would be in the power of any servant they chose to bring? Surely there was no limit, positively none, to what the girl might do or say. How was she going to bear her about her, endure the sight and sound of that veiled impertinence? She buried her head very deep in the cushion, vainly striving to blot out the world and Annalise in its feathers. But even there was no peace, for suddenly a great noise of doors going and legs striding penetrated through its stuffiness, and she heard Fritzing's voice very loud and near. All sounds in Creeper Cottage were loud and near, ordering Annalise to ask her Grand Ducal Highness to descend. "I won't," thought Priscilla, burying her head deeper. "That poor Emma has lost the note and is going to fuss. I won't descend." Then came Annalise's tap at her door. Priscilla did not answer. Annalise tapped again. Priscilla did not answer, but turning her head face upwards, composed herself to an appearance of sleep. Annalise tapped a third time. "The Herr Geheimrath wishes to speak to your Grand Ducal Highness," she called through the door, and after a pause opened it and peeped in. "Her Grand Ducal Highness sleeps," she informed Fritzing down the stairs, her nose at the angle in the air it always took when she spoke to him. "Then wake her, wake her," cried Fritzing. "Is it possible something has happened?" thought Annalise joyfully, her eyes gleaming as she willingly flew back to Priscilla's door. Anything, anything, she thought, sooner than the life she was leading. Priscilla heard Fritzing's order and sat up at once, surprised at such an unprecedented indifference to her comfort. Her heart began to beat faster. A swift fear that Kunitz was at her heels seized her. She jumped up and ran out. Fritzing was standing at the foot of the stairs. "Come down, ma'am," he said. "I must speak to you at once." "What's the matter?" asked Priscilla, getting down the steep little stairs as quickly as was possible without tumbling. Hateful English tongue, thought Annalise, to whom the habit the Princess and Fritzing had got into of talking English together was a constant annoyance and disappointment. Fritzing preceded Priscilla into her parlour, and when she was in, shut the door behind her. Then he leaned his hands on the table to steady himself and confronted her with a twitching face. Priscilla looked at him appalled. Was the Grand Duke around the corner, lingering perhaps among the very tombs just outside her window? "What is it?" she asked faintly. "Ma'am, the £5 has disappeared for ever." "Really, Fritzi, you're too absurd about that wretched £5," cried Priscilla, blazing into anger. "But it was all we had." "All we—" "Ma'am, it was positively our last penny." I don't understand." He made her understand with paper and pencil, with the bills and his own calculations. He made her understand. His hand shook, but he went through with them item by item, through everything they had spent from the moment they left Kunitz. They were in such a corner, so tightly jammed, that all efforts to hide it and pretend there was no corner seemed to him folly. He now saw that such efforts always had been folly, and that he ought to have seen to it that her mind on this important point was from the first perfectly clear. Then nothing would have happened. "You have had the misfortune, ma'am, to choose a fool for your protector in this adventure," he said bitterly, pushing the papers from him as though he loathed the sight of them. Priscilla sat dumbfounded. She was looking quite straight for the first time at certain pitiless aspects of life. For the first time she was face to face with the sternness, the hardness, the relentlessness of everything that has to do with money as soon as one has not got any. It seemed almost incredible to her that she, who had given so lavishly to anybody and everybody, who had been so glad to give, who had thought of money when she thought of it at all as a thing to be passed on, as a thing that soiled one unless it was passed on, but that passed on became strangely glorified and powerful for good. It seemed incredible that she should be in need of it herself, and unable to think of a single person who would give her some. And what a little she needed, just to tide them over the next week or two until they'd got theirs from home. Yet even that little, the merest nothing compared to what she had flung about in the village, was as unattainable as though it had been a fortune. Can we not borrow?" she said at last. "Yes, ma'am, we can and we must. I will proceed this evening to Symford Hall and borrow of Augustus." "No," said Priscilla, so suddenly and so energetically that Fritzing started. "No, ma'am?" he repeated, astonished. "Why, he's the very person. In fact, he's our only hope. He must and shall help us." "No," repeated Priscilla, still more energetically. "Pray, ma'am," said Fritzing, shrugging his shoulders, "are these women's whims? I never comprehend them rightly, and doubt if I ever shall. Are they to be allowed to lead us even in dangerous crises? To lead us to certain shipwreck, ma'am. The alternatives in this case are three. Permit me to point them out. Either we return to Kunitz—" "Oh," shivered Priscilla, shrinking as from a blow. "Or, after a brief period of starvation and other violent discomfort, we are cast into jail for debt." "Oh?" shivered Priscilla in tones of terrified inquiry. "Or I borrow of Augustus." "No," said Priscilla just as energetically as before. "Augustus is wealthy. Augustus is willing. Ma'am, I would stake my soul that he is willing." "You shall not borrow of him," said Priscilla. He's too ill." "Well then, ma'am," said Fritzing with a gesture of extreme exasperation, "since you cannot be allowed to be cast into jail, there remains but Kunitz. Like the dogs of the Scriptures, we will return—" "Why not borrow of the vicar?" interrupted Priscilla. "Surely he would be glad to help anyone in difficulties." "Of the vicar? What, of the father of the young man who insulted your Grand Ducal Highness, and whom I propose to kill in duel at my first leisure moment? Ma'am, there are depths of infamy to which even a desperate man will not descend." Priscilla dug holes in the tablecloth with the point of the pencil. "I can't conceive," she said, "why you gave Annalise all that money. So much." Why, ma'am, she refused unless I did to prepare your Grand Ducal Highness's tea." "Oh, Fritzi!" Priscilla looked up at him, shaking her head and smiling through all her troubles. Was ever so much love and so much folly united in one wise old man? Was ever, for that matter, so expensive a tea? "I admit I permitted the immediate, the passing moment to blot out the future from my clearer vision on that occasion." "On that occasion? Oh, Fritzi, what about all the other occasions? When you gave me all I asked for the poor people, for my party, you must have suffered tortures of anxiety, and all by yourself. Oh, Fritzi, it was dear of you, perfectly wonderfully dear. But you ought to have been different with me from the beginning, treated me exactly as you would have treated a real niece." "Ma'am," cried Fritzing, jumping up, "this is a waste of time. Our case is very urgent. Money must be obtained. You must allow me to judge in this matter, however ill I have acquitted myself up to now. I shall start at once for Symford Hall and obtain a loan of Augustus." Priscilla pushed back her chair and got up too. "My dear Fritzi, please leave that unfortunate young man out of the question," she said, flushing. "How can you worry a person who is ill in bed with such things?" "His mother is not ill in bed and will do quite as well. I am certainly going." "You are not going. I won't have you ask his mother. I forbid you to do anything of the sort. Oh, Fritzi," she added in despair, for he had picked up the hat and stick he had flung down on coming in, and was evidently not going to take the least notice of her commands. "Oh, Fritzi, you can't ask Tussie for money. It would kill him to know we were in difficulties." "Kill him, ma'am? Why should it kill him?" shouted Fritzing, exasperated by such a picture of softness. "It wouldn't only kill him, it would be simply too dreadful besides," said Priscilla, greatly distressed. "Why, he asked me this afternoon, I wasn't going to tell you, but you force me to, he asked me this very afternoon to marry him, and the dreadful part is that I'm afraid he thinks, he hopes, that I'm going to." End of chapter 19.